U.S. Grant and Native Relations. By 1867, the U.S. government's push to confine native tribes with designated lands gained force through treaties meant to bring stability to an increasingly tense frontier. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge was among the most significant of these agreements, relocating the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche tribes to what later would become Oklahoma, or known at that time as Indian Territory. The treaty allowed these Plains tribes to retain some semblance of their traditional way of life. They could leave the reservation to hunt during the summer, but with the rapid extinction of the buffalo across the plains, even the seasonal independence dwindled, pushing more and more native families to the reservations to survive. Into this tense landscape, President Ulysses S. Grant stepped with a plan to temper the ongoing conflicts in the West. His quote-unquote peace policy, introduced in 1868, was an attempt to steer clear of the bloody toil exacted by the Indian Wars. Grant saw the wars as a needless drain on American lives and treasury, and his peace policy aimed to reduce conflict by segregating and closely controlling native populations. Under this policy, the reservation system would function as a tool to clear land for white settlement and keep native tribes at a distance, with resources allocated only to those who complied with U.S. control. Yet this quote-unquote peace came at the cost of independence and dignity for native peoples. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who oversaw many Western campaigns, summed it up in brutal terms. And I quote, "Remove all to a safe place and reduce them to a helpless condition." End quote. One of the last major treaties of this period was the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868 after the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes had united to defend their Powder River Valley hunting grounds. The agreement promised the Sioux, including the Lakota, exclusive control of the Black Hills, land sacred to their people. It was a hard-won negotiation, and while many Sioux leaders saw the value in the treaty, several prominent chiefs, including Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, refused to sign. They held fast to the belief that no agreement could safeguard their land from further intrusion, and history would soon prove them right. In 1871, Grant's peace policy took a more combative turn, signaling the end of the Comanche Empire, or Comancheria, in the southern plains. Following a period of uneasy truce, the U.S. government opted for an aggressive military campaign, dispatching 3,000 soldiers to break the Comanche resistance once and for all. In a scorched earth strategy that targeted the last remaining bison herds, U.S. forces effectively starved the Comanche into submission, obliterating their primary food source and economic lifeline. As bison carcasses littered the plains, the once powerful Comanche Empire crumbled, its survivors, some 1,500 people, seeking refuge at Fort Still, Oklahoma. By then, the last remnants of the Comancheria had been extinguished. By the early 1870s, the Northern California landscape saw another brutal confrontation unfold in the Modoc War, a conflict unique among Indian wars for its location, tactics, and tragic toll. The ancestral homelands of the Modoc people was a rugged terrain of sagebrush-covered lava plateaus and forested mountains. This land, spread across what is now Northern California and Southern Oregon, supported the Modoc's way of life, and Tule Lake and the Lost River, providing fish, wild game, and plants. Yet by the 1860s, settlers had begun to encroach upon this territory, disrupting the Modoc way of life and setting the stage for conflict. The Modoc War erupted on November 29, 1872, marking a rare and fierce confrontation in California. Although tensions had simmered as early as 1826, It was during these few violent months that one of the most costly engagements in Native American and U.S. military history would play out. The Modoc were a small force, numbering only 60 fighters, but their intimate knowledge of the land gave them an advantage that even the most seasoned soldiers found difficult to counter. Facing up to 600 U.S. troops at any given time, the Modoc held their ground with courage and tenacity. What made the Modoc War particularly brutal was not only the terrain, but also the unusual level of U.S. casualties. At its end, in June of 1873, 53 U.S. soldiers, 17 civilians, and 15 Modoc warriors lay dead. The majority of these Modoc deaths were not from battles themselves, but from capture and execution following the war. Among the fallen on the U.S. side was a general, marking the only instance in U.S. history where a general was killed in an Indian war, a fact that further fueled public outcry and stoked the federal government's determination to suppress indigenous resistance across the entire West. The Modoc War, though numerically small, was one of the most costly in terms of resources and lives, highlighting the extreme lengths the U.S. government would go to wrest control from Native peoples. For the Modoc, the war symbolized a desperate last stand to protect a homeland that was more than a landscape to them. It was a lifeline, a spiritual anchor, and the foundation for their identity. And yet, the war's outcome was a bitter reminder of the overwhelming force Native communities faced. They were no longer mere conflicts for territory, but pitched battles for cultural survival against a nation relentless in its westward ambition. As President Grant's peace policy disintegrated into full-scale war and the campaign to exterminate the buffalo accelerated, the fate of Native communities across the West grew grimmer. The vision of reservations as quote-unquote safe havens became increasingly hollow as federal policies strangled the autonomy and resources of these lands, lying bare the grim irony of peace achieved through war. For the Cheyenne, Sioux, Comanche, Modoc, and countless other tribes, each treaty and battle brought them closer to the edge, their worlds transformed and dismantled under the relentless drive of a nation fueled by manifest destiny and the promise of a continental empire.